So it's my pleasure to introduce our SASNAM president, who will be our speaker, Dr. Stuart More. So as we all know, Stuart doesn't need an introduction. He is the acting head of the nuclear medicine department at Grooteske Hospital and at UCT. And he is also the president of SASNAM. And as president of SASNAM, we are very proud because he has achieved quite a lot in his presidency, including establishing a memorandum of agreement with international congresses such as SNMMI. We had the president of SNMMI for the first time in our congress in SASNAM, and we're very proud for what you have achieved, Stuart. Also with the EANM, as well as the Swiss Congress and the APNM. So Dr. More, sorry. Yeah, I spent so much time with Andrew. He's passionate about mentorship, and he pioneered the first ever Young Nuclear Physicians Forum, which was held in Pretoria in 2021. And he hopes that it will continue even after his tenure has ended as president, or maybe he might be voted in for a second term, we don't know. So thank you so much, Stuart. We look forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Bawi. Remember you said you're going to host it in Durban, if it does come back to you. Yeah, so we will do that definitely. So thank you, colleagues, for giving me the opportunity to chat with respect to this process. It's a little bit left field because it's, I think, a topic that has got impact for the country, but I think we will have context as to a way forward, and I'll focus a lot more on the mentorship aspect of it as we're going along for this, and this will be a kind of reiteration of that initial process that we started in 2021. Okay, but if you can look up what PhD does look like, and I'm not sure if you can look at it in the dictionary, but basically it's an academic that has learned more and more about less and less until know everything about absolutely nothing, which tends to happen sometimes because you become an expert on a topic that is very niche, but you might be the only person who knows about that, you know. I still remember when I was at varsity, we used to have this concept where you had somebody talking about you being the expert of the left Purkinje fiber in the upper zone, which becomes a bit more ridiculous as you go along there. But this is quite important to recognize about what expertise one does get and how then impacts on society. But essentially, if we look at the contribution of science that does occur with pursuing doctoral studies, the idea is that you're wanting to be able to combine different methodologies, and that's what's key. It kind of takes you out of your comfort zone to be able to learn new techniques that will influence how will change whatever field that you are in. And in nuclear medicine, it's quite interesting because we have such a huge allied discipline. So whilst you might be a physician, and if you are kind of peering into different aspects of your tenure, that it actually does get more applicable. And the idea is that with your supervisor guiding you, you know much more than them, and you become an expert at the end of it. But like I said, you end up knowing nothing, a little bit more, but nothing, anything else there. Where I want to just get the highlight is, where does this come from? A South African aspect is the output crisis. And I know a lot of the colleagues who are in academics will know the need of, actually around about this time when the MMed became mandatory for a lot of the physicians to actually pursue. But the idea was that we can practice, and this came from an editorial by Chris Bateman, and it was led by Prof. Mayosi at that time, the late Professor Mayosi. And if you think about it, 10 years later, this is still kind of the case in terms of where that output crisis is. And there are a lot more challenges in terms of how we're getting out what we're needing to do, because the mandatory aspect might be putting out research that's not so good. But the idea is that we haven't built a good cohort of what we have called doctoral studies, not only in the physicians, but in all our fields, in particularly nuclear medicine, radiopharmacy, radiochemistry, physics as well. And this is something that will need to be addressed as we go along. We're hoping that we will go and sort that out. If you look at this from 2014, in terms of the kind of balance of where the doctoral graduates are coming from and what the resource and capacity is, you can see obviously with South Africa being kind of right to the bottom, that there still isn't a good grounding force with respect to the amount of candidates that are being pursued and actually coming forward for that. And it's something that we need to look at. But why this is important, and it's about why PhDs might be quite useful, and this comes from an article that was in The Conversation. And if you go and read this, you can go look it up. It was about 4 or 5 years ago, when looking at the benefits of what it was, and obviously there's always two balances to what this might look like. And the first one you can look at is, it does help you to achieve your research outputs and publications. And obviously universities have different criteria depending on where you are about what those look like. From a thinking and a modality aspect, it's solving this important problem allows for the curiosity, and that's quite key. If you're not curious, you're not able to do this at all. And the idea is that you become part of a bigger group of researchers and a bigger network, which is what we try to do and aim for. And a lot of our colleagues and the mentors we have around here are kind of sorting it out. The idea in terms of what is a disadvantage is that if you have a PhD, you earn more? Not necessarily. If you're doing it because your friend is doing it, that also might not be such a good idea. But if you're in your current state of work and you're doing this to get out of that, that's also problematic too. So those are the things about the balance of why you wouldn't want to pursue a PhD, but I think this is quite important. What I will point you to direction, this was actually one that was done in 2019, and this is from the University of Stellenbosch, was a state of this research enterprise, and it looked at all fields. And health, in terms of that, they, in 2016, only showed output of about 500 in total across 497 actually doctoral candidates who've actually passed through the system. It's a dense document, 302 pages, so just be aware of that. But if you look at the opportunities, I think it's important to recognize, this might jump again, so apologies, it's going to come back because it's where I took it out. But what you want to figure out is, what is the research gap that you want to investigate? What are you curious about? What are you trying to figure out, you know? What are you most passionate about within that? And if not, does your mentor supervise something that you can actually investigate? Then the next point is about, where can you find your supervisor? Sometimes your supervisor might not be in your home institution. They could be in an institution that's allied to you. They could be outside the country. They could be in another home department. And so these are things that one needs to consider as well. The next one, which we're going to focus on a lot more, is about, where can I find a good research mentor who's going to help you to navigate this field. The next thing you need to look in terms of opportunities, what do your own timelines and goals look like, not just with the research, but with life? Do you want to start a family? Do you have responsibilities with your family? What does that look like? Because that will also play into how you kind of figure out whether you're going to do this journey with the PhD. And then, what do I need to add to my professional development in this process? What kind of skill set am I going to have to learn to make sure that I can actually reach my research goals? Am I going to have to learn a bit more statistics to be able to answer certain questions? Am I going to have to learn a laboratory technique to be able to sort it out? Am I going to have to sit down and learn machine learning, for example, if your project has it there? So these are all kind of aspects that one needs to be aware of. And this actually becomes part of how you start thinking about the world differently, because you're pursuing all of these engagements there. And so be aware of what it might look like. And I'll talk to you a bit more about my journey about this as well we go forward. But if you look at your plan, this is what we think it looks like. Very linear. We get to the goalpost in itself there. But I think majority of people who have gone through this process or are undergoing it at the moment, Beth included, you know this already, we spoke about this last night, is it looks like that, okay? You're always going to go through these troughs. There are always going to be challenges. There are always going to be goalposts and stops that are going to prevent you from making it look linear. But what's quite nice about this, this cartoon is that you'll notice that you're actually elevating going up, which is quite important in the fact that you actually do grow as you go along in this process, and that's the key part of why we're doing this. So let's talk about the key barriers. I think it's going to be important. Sometimes just actually the process of being able to do this can be quite difficult. So people, when you're putting this together, learning how to do, for example, what a concept note is, it's just an executive summary of the research, can be something that's quite difficult. And if you don't know how to do it, that's also quite important to understand that you have guidance for that. And there's obviously fear. And the fear comes from, am I going to ever be able to complete this? Am I going to have the necessary requisite experience to be able to sort it out? And that's important to navigate as well. The other part can happen, and then this happens in all institutions, regardless where it is, internally, externally, is whether you have somebody who's quite inexperienced and unsupportive in your journey. And sometimes people actually have to break those ties and then actually find new supervisors who can actually help that. I think one of the biggest ones, which is point number 4, is funding. And I think we've had this conversation lots of times, Bowie, about trying to figure this out with respect to how does one actually get this sorted out, because do I take time out of my normal career to be able to pursue this? And if I do that, where is that money going to come to sustain a living? These are key aspects to sort out. And in South Africa, it's quite interesting because for physicians, for example, there are some opportunities that exist, for example, like the Discovery Foundation that help with funding. NRF is one as well that can exist, but it's very ageist at times because it depends on where you are. So you have to be at the age of 32 before you can apply for PhD, as an example. Beyond that, it's quite difficult. There is something, the Tutuka Fund is something else that can happen there as well. But MRC also has got funding models that exist as well. For a physician, for example, they can give you about 500,000, but over a 2-year period to be able to do that funding as well. And then there's obviously the Mayosi Scholarship for those who are specialists who are groomed there. But it applies also to physicists as well as anybody in the allied disciplines. These opportunities do exist. You just have to go and find them and look to see what actually suits you. The problem is that the standard of living currently doesn't necessarily meet those criteria, so people are having to supplement it all the time. And giving somebody a stipend of 130,000 Rand a year is not actually adequate enough, because generally they're doing this full time. The most important part of it, obviously, is I think it's the kind of the idealistic aspect is we're trying to change the world. The timelines, which I kind of spoke to and alluded to earlier. And then sometimes, depending on where you are, especially if you're not doing it full time, you can get quite tired and it can stall, depending on your projects. I had a colleague who spoke about the fact that when she started a project, she would avoid her supervisor on purpose. And it was a supervisor had to kind of catch up with her. Now she's the associate professor of clinical pharmacology at UCT and head of that division now. But her journey was quite limited because of this fear and intrepidation of going through that. And then, of course, the last one I alluded to as well is where your family background is, what you're having to do. We know in this part of the world there's a lot of things like black tax, that can also cause issues depending where you are. So these are things that are actually important to recognize as you go along. But what I'm going to focus on at the moment in terms of where we're going with this is focusing on the supervisor and what that mentorship aspect would look like. I've got 8 minutes that I have to do this in, so if I rush, please understand that. And Olwethu will let me know. So, question is, do you have a current mentor in your career? Just listen to the question, if you have one. That's the first thing I'm going to ask you. You don't have to put your hand up, it's all rhetorical, so just be aware of that. Do you have a coach in your career? Actually, coaches of both different teams that are rivals now in the football league at the moment. So just be aware of that. Do you have a coach? Do you have somebody who sponsors you in your career? And I'll talk to these as well as we go along there. And the last one I want to talk about, do you have a connector in your area, in this space? Nihad is looking at me and laughing at that. So, why is this important? Is because we look at the concept of the mentorship, and I want to just highlight this term, and it hasn't actually changed for a long time. But I'm highlighting, so it's dynamic, reciprocal relationship and environment between somebody who's advanced in their career, who is the mentor, and a beginner, who is your mentee, who's aimed in highlighting the career development of both. So both people benefit from this arrangement. And it actually can be something that would be protracted, or it can be something that's lifelong. And if you have a really good mentor, something that actually stays with you for the rest of your life. And that's important to recognize that. And why this is important is because if you look at the key elements of it, they choose mentees using small assessments to see how responsive they are. So if you get a task that is given to you and you're not able to execute it within the allotted time, that does cause impact on how your mentor might view you. Expectations with respect to communication productivity is also quite key. The next thing is important is being able to deal with the behaviors that support mentee growth. So looking at their background, looking to see how it is the person a single person? Is the person a family person? Do they have responsibilities at home? Are they having to sort things? These are all important because how you engage in it will depend on what their productivity is going to be as well. And then also dealing with conflict and the rifts that might actually arise from that, because not all relationships are going to go through smooth sailing as well. Just to highlight to you with respect to the coach and the sponsor. So the coach is very much a person within within the research domain, you might not see it as often. It's more kind of in the work and clinical domain. But they basically will help you for specific tasks that will happen within in a context there. And it's exactly like that. The specific skill set that you need within a context to be able to work through. So they'll talk to you, whereas the mentor talks with you to guide you on your journey. But the sponsor is quite an important one, because this is the person who advocates for you where you're not even in the room, and they'll speak on your behalf. And they're doing it at their own risk of their own reputation sometimes. So just be aware of that as you're going along with that. And the questions that we're going to highlight now is yes, it's nice when all mentorship goes right, but sometimes it goes terribly wrong. And I'm going to highlight a few things for this year, when things go horribly wrong. So we're going to start with the mentor malpractices. Mentor. So there are different characteristics here. So the first one's the hijacker. So the hijacker is a mentor who will take the hostages, mentees' ideas, and then they'll say that they own and take credit for it. So if they're struggling in their own career, this is what will happen. And what happens is that sometimes if the mentee is not strong enough, they end up having a Stockholm syndrome, and that's the issue. The next one is, this is a guy who saddles lots of people with low activities. And what happens is that instead of putting them in terms of doing work that's related to their research, they do admin. And the problem is that they don't actually want to cultivate their students at all. So there's something also to be aware of. The third one is the possessor. Those of you who play Mortal Kombat, you'll know that's Shang Tsung who's actually taking the soul of that guy. Okay, I am an avid arcade game player, so dominates the mentee. And they're very insecure in their context there, okay? And they can be seen as passive-aggressive. So you have this battered spouse syndrome, which is problematic. So they're not able to actually connect with their mentor at all. And that's the problem. The next one I want to give you context to is the bottleneck. So they're doing their own thing, they've got their own projects they're worried about, they don't attend to any of the needs. So you might give them stuff to say, please look at my research, please look at my outcomes. Doesn't happen at all, okay? And so the productivity of your mentee goes down. The next one I want you to give a context to is the country clubber. So this one is very easy. This one does not like conflict at all, okay? Wants to be everybody's friend, and they basically want to say if you've got lots of people around them, then they know that they're quite popular. And so they disadvantage all of their mentees because of that. And this one, obviously you can imagine, is the world traveler. They're relatively successful, they go into speaking engagements, and at times what happens that when they're looking back at their mentees that they're looking after, they don't actually have time for them because they've got all these engagements everywhere in the world. And the problem is that if you become more successful, there's a risk that this will happen. And so as a mentor, we need to be aware of this when you're interacting with your mentees. But what happens when the mentee misbehaves? I'm going back to this definition of the beginner who's promoting the career development both, because it works both ways. So yes, you could have problems from the mentor side, but the mentee can also do it as well. So let's see what that looks like. The overcommitter. I think a lot of people like that. You can't say no. And then they do a lot of tasks that don't benefit the career whatsoever. And so this ends up with burnout. A lot of type A personalities happen in that aspect. The next one I want to talk to you about is the doormat, who doesn't even get noticed at whatsoever. And they're used also similarly, they get lots of work that doesn't get lots of attention, not lots of reward. They don't get to go to meetings or congresses or any sort of effect. So that's important to recognize that one. The next one I want you to give is the vampire. Now this one's quite an interesting one, because they'll go there, they'll go to the mentor, they will basically spam them with everything, emails, cell phone, WhatsApp, everything, and that's a problem. And the reason why they're doing that, because they're quite insecure in making decisions for themselves. But they're really, really highly driven, and they're really good at what they're doing, but they needed validation to be able to move on to the next task. So this is quite an important one to be aware of. I think sometimes some of us are all little vampires came in our own way. The next one I want to talk about is the backstabber. So they'll look at you, they'll accept everything, they'll work and they perform their duties, but then when they are problematic, they'll resent criticism, and then if something goes wrong, the excuse for every failure sorted out, they will be problematic. The last one I want to talk about is the one who disappears, who is the lone wolf who tells you, I don't need a mentor, I'll be fine. That does happen too, okay? And so they're stubborn and they might be resistant, but when you look back at why they're doing this behavior, it's because something's happened to them to actually make them a lone wolf. So they might have been disadvantaged or something sidelined them in the past. So when you're looking at the person who's the lone wolf, what's the right thing to do? I've got 1 minute left, so I want you to be aware when you're interacting and you're starting this process with engaging with opportunities with your mentor, make sure you know what your needs are with your projects and have something written down for everything that you go to. So when you go to your mentor, make sure you write it down and make sure you ask them pertinent questions that they're going to be able to engage with you so that you're not wasting your time. But as a mentee, you also need to reach out because the mentor is just there to guide you, but don't expect them to do everything for you. I think it was, yeah. And you must keep to your word as well. It's also quite important. But when things are celebrated, celebrate them. Please do that. But ask for the advice and listen, because if something does need to change in terms of your project and where it's going on, you need to be able to explain why that is happening. And then I want you to be able to reassess the relationship. So if you're meeting with your mentor, make sure you meet them regularly. Accept your limitations. Know when you don't know what you're doing and know how to go and ask for that help. And if the mentor's ineffective, know when you have to move to somebody else. That's also important. So look at those red flags with the malpractice. But try to build a mentorship team. So if you have a mentor, it's one person, but generally it's going to be more than one person that you're going to be seeing. There'll be somebody who's primarily in that aspect there, so be aware of that. But what I want you to recognize here is that the PhD will definitely, if you're not careful, end up with permanent head damage if you're not going to sort this out very. So I'll just be aware of that as you're going along. And actually, that's in summary of where I am at the moment in terms of challenges there. So I'm actually this is actually the last slide over there, but I wanted you to be aware of the key components of how this works there. So thank you very much for giving me the platform to be able to give insight into this here. And if there are any questions, I'm going to actually delay to much later in the break. I'll be happy to chat about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.